This is kind of a follow-up to the previous cut content video. There's really not that much more to discuss in those regards, at least not enough to justify a third video dedicated to it, but there's a few other bits of fun development trivia for the series that I think are worth mentioning. So here's one last video covering some assorted development trivia and unused concepts for the Versus games. Most people know Norimaro as that peculiar guest character in the Japanese versions of Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, created by Japanese comedian Noritake Kanashi. If you play the Japanese versions of the arcade game or its ports on PS1 and Saturn, Norimaro is freely selectable there, whereas he can't be selected in the international releases. However, the deal Capcom inked for Norimaro apparently could have landed him in another Capcom fighter altogether if development plans had lined up a bit differently. Tatsuya Akitomo, a name you might recognize if you've watched my previous videos, recalled being told by longtime former Capcom producer Yoshio Okamoto that the deal for Norimaro was to include him as a guest character in whatever Street Fighter related game was farthest along in development that could accommodate his inclusion. Akitomo mused that there was really only one other game that could have possibly been.
Street Fighter 3 New Generation.
And I mean, could you imagine the timeline where Norimaro of all characters got into Street Fighter 3? I mean, if anything, it'd probably make New Generation a little more memorable.
Same, please.
Akitomo went on to add that he suspects that Okamoto deliberately lined things up production-wise so that Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter was the only viable option. And I think most of us can probably agree that was a good call. Speaking of Norimaro, continuing with Akitomo's insight on his time with the Versus games, he brought up the topic of humor-based characters. In the previous video, I talked about how Howard the Duck and She-Hulk were thrown around as potential additions to Marvel vs. Capcom 1. There was one other character I neglected to mention there, Peter Porker, the spectacular Spider-Ham. When Howard the Duck was brought up as a potential character, Capcom USA in particular said it'd be a bad call, citing how disastrous the feature film with him went over. They did, however, suggest Spider-Ham in his place instead. In the end, they decided not to go with him because of a general desire to move away from dedicated joke characters. And they figured he might have been a bit too much of a Marvel deep cut, with Akitomo noting that this was long before Into the Spider-Verse made him a household name. Due to a lack of character endings and generally no background NPCs and stages, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 isn't a game with very many cameos, and most of the ones that are there only show up in character movesets. Captain Commando has the Commando team, Sabretooth has Birdie, Jill has the Tyrant, and so on and so forth. One character with a few cameos associated with them is Hayato, and I've touched on that a bit in his character analysis video, but I think it bears mentioning here as well. Various characters cameo in Hayato's win poses. Sometimes it's Saturn, sometimes it's Elle, and sometimes it's June, who tends to be the character that finds herself with cameos in crossover games the most. At some point though, she was intended to be a little more involved, as the March 2000 issue of Arcadia Gaming magazine showcases some concept art for some action sprites involving her, with a caption mentioning that a lot of stuff took place during Marvel 2's development. Whether she would have been a baked-in moveset assist like Birdie or the Commando Squad, or shown up in a hyper combo like Lilith, we'll probably never know, but it's neat to see the idea of her cameo not going entirely to waste. While we're talking about Star Gladiator, there is one other character from the series considered for a Versus game. In an interview from the Another Play guide for Capcom vs. SNK 2, essentially a strategy guidebook for the game, the developers talked about their rationale for choosing characters. They wanted to primarily focus on characters from both companies' fighting game and beat-em-up history, and wanted a healthy balance of characters not seen in a while, and instantly recognizable faces. However, there was one proposed character that was eventually deemed to be a little too niche, even for the developers, Rain from Plasma Sword. Rain is the daughter of series antagonist Bill Stein, and has a whole wild backstory involving her father's plans to use her to enslave the human race. She fights with a plasma scythe, which is kind of a really cool weapon, but I guess they looked at how most people went who when Hayato was selected for Marvel 2 and went in a different direction instead. This is just speculation on my part, but I wouldn't be surprised if this ended up leading to the decision to use a rival school's character instead, being Capcom's other marginally more recognizable 3D fighter at the time. Capcom Fighting Evolution is not a well-regarded game. Hastily put together using assets from previous 2D Capcom fighters and not in an especially fun way like Marvel 2, Fighting Evolution was meant to fill a gap that would have originally been occupied by the cancelled Capcom Fighting All-Stars. This was a 3D fighter in the vein of Star Gladiator and Rival Schools that see various Capcom franchises like Street Fighter, Final Fight, Rival Schools, and Strider cross over in a conflict regarding the mysterious code holders, original characters created specifically for this game. Ingrid, one of those code holders, eventually did get realized in Capcom Fighting Evolution though. Most people aware of the history of Capcom Fighting Evolution's development know this. However, one often overlooked fact about Fighting All-Stars is that it was built from the ashes of another not publicly announced and eventually internally shelved Capcom fighter, and this fighting game was a versus game. Street Fighter V and 6 director Takayuki Nakayama interviewed the director of Fighting All-Stars, Toyohisa Tanabe, in a feature for the Shadaloo CRI website for Street Fighter V. When asking him how development of the game started, Tanabe mentions that it actually began development just after another Capcom fighting game was cancelled. The idea was to reuse the assets from this cancelled fighting game to get a head start in development for Fighting All-Stars. Nakayama responds with the game in question, though the name of said game is cheekily censored. Looking at how it's censored though, it doesn't leave much to the imagination. The first two words are obviously Capcom and Versus, and the third word, well, there's only one company Capcom's crossed over with 3 letters. And yeah, it's exactly the game you're thinking of. A couple years later, Polygon had a feature on the development of the Capcom vs SNK games, which I highly recommend reading by the way. And in one portion in particular, CVS 1 and 2 director Hideaki Itsuno flat out confirms that yeah, Capcom vs SNK 3 was at one point in time in development. According to Itsuno, development started right after CVS 2 wrapped, with the game initially aiming for a similar presentation style of 2D sprites on 3D backgrounds. However, they decided to pivot towards it being made entirely in 3D instead, which makes some sense here. Itsuno himself was the director of Power Stone, Rival Schools, and Star Gladiator, all 3D fighting games from Capcom. The game was cancelled, however, due to the financial woes and eventual collapse of SNK. One really interesting thing to note though is that Nakayama himself says in his interview with Tanabe that he's seen design documents and drafts for the game. So in some drawer or on some hard drive at Capcom, there's Capcom vs SNK 3 design concepts unseen to all but those who worked on the game. I wonder if they'll ever see the light of day. Speaking of entire games that could have been, let's double back to that Akitomo tweet thread for a sec, because in the midst of his Marvel vs. Capcom tidbits, he dropped a bomb about an entirely different game being pitched. It's not quite a versus game, but given what the game might have been, I think it warrants mentioning here. At some point in early 2000, Capcom was apparently approached by DC Comics in regards to potentially making a Justice League game for them. Akitomo, one of the people instrumental in fostering the Capcom and Marvel developer relationship was at the time, asked for his opinion on whether or not they should move forward. Akitomo's opinion was that it wouldn't be a good idea for various reasons. First and foremost, having experience with the Marvel games, Akitomo cited that balancing DC characters for a fighting game would be even more of a nightmare than doing so for Marvel characters. Akitomo continued, mentioning how the comic industry, but specifically DC, wasn't exactly in a healthy place at the time, with the only DC property not in mostly dire straits being Batman at the time. On top of that, Capcom was largely in a transition period. Arcades were more or less dead outside of Japan, and Capcom as a whole were committing fully to full-scale console game development. An arcade-style fighting game with DC characters just wasn't something they could reasonably do at the time. And while those are pretty reasonable points, man, could you imagine? Outside of one-offs like Justice League Task Force and Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, we really wouldn't get a good DC fighter until Injustice. A Capcom-developed DC fighter would have been a sight to behold, and who knows, maybe they would have even eventually crossed over with Capcom. You ever play Kenichi, the Mightiest Disciple? I bet you probably haven't. This was a Japan-only fighting game released late into the PlayStation 2 lifespan in 2007. So why am I talking about this game? Well, as it so happens, this game was published by Capcom, but even more interesting is the game's developer, Eighting. You might know Eighting as the developer of licensed games like the Naruto Clash of Ninja games, and more relevantly, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom and Marvel vs. Capcom 3. It's Tatsunoko vs. Capcom that's the relevant game here, as there's a neat bit of trivia that links the game to Mightiest Disciple. In a Dengeki Online interview from 2010 with Tatsunoko vs. Capcom producer Ryota Nitsuma and Eighting producer Ryota Igawa, the subject of Ingrid was brought up. Ingrid was shown in the secret file for Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, showing some in-development pictures of her. This interview actually goes into more detail about what exactly was going on here. In the early pre-production stages of Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, Nitsuma asked Igawa if it'd be possible to cook up a model of Ingrid to use for testing purposes, since at the time Ingrid was the last new fighting game character created by Capcom. Because this pre-production period likely intersected with the latter half of development on Mightiest Disciple, Igawa mentions that he took a model from that game and used it as a base to essentially reskin it to being Ingrid, which they then used in their TVC prototypes. An interesting note is that the model itself was also apparently ported back into Mightiest Disciple by Igawa, just to see if it'd work. I have no idea if they ended up leaving that model on the retail disc or not, and I kind of doubt it, but it's pretty neat that a completely unrelated licensed fighter had a technical role to play in the development of a Versus game. Furthermore, if you look closely at those secret file screenshots of Ingrid, you can see that despite the unique model, she's actually rigged for Chun-Li's animations, further emphasizing that Ingrid was likely never meant to be on the roster and was only for testing purposes. She was apparently legitimately considered for Marvel 3 though. While we're on the subject of TVC secret file, there's a little more I'd like to discuss there. People are generally aware of some of the Capcom related stuff depicted in that, like Phoenix Wright, the Ingrid test model, and the scrapped Ghost and Goblin stage, but no one ever seems to mention the Tatsunoko stuff. You can see scrapped early character model work done for what seems to be Mutaking, the protagonist of Mutaking, the Dashing Warrior, a Tatsunoko production from the early 80s. The most interesting feature here regards Nurse Witch Komugi from the anime of the same name, itself a spin-off of Soul Taker, a property also considered for the game. She's listed on the list of considered but scrapped Tatsunoko characters that I've referenced in previous videos, but as it turns out, the story behind the work done on her is actually pretty interesting. Apparently, the folks at Eighting on the development team had some huge fans of the character, and actually began work for her for the Ultimate All-Stars release in secret, getting a character model done and even conceptualizing her entire moveset. However, they didn't show this to the game's producer Ryota Nitsuma until much later in development, and he was caught off guard, since not even Tatsunoko knew she was being worked on. In the end, according to Nitsuma, because of time and budget constraints, they had to make a decision between either her or Tekkaman Blade, and in the end they went with the latter as he had a bit more international appeal. That's not where this story ends though. The work on Komugi that had been done was so extensive that Nitsuma thought it'd be a total waste to scrap it completely, never to see the light of day. So he got approval from Tatsunoko to showcase the work done on her in the game's secret file. For a while, I had always thought that the display of her in the secret file was concept artwork, but looking closer, it's clear that this is actually the character model they made for her. Considering how polished it looks, they must have not been kidding about how far in development she got. Furthermore, below the model pictures are a breakdown of what her moveset would have entailed. The first 3 rows talk about her standing heavy attack, her crouching medium attack, and her jumping heavy attacks. The blue rows talk about her special moves, and the 2 on the bottom outline 2 of her hyper combos. According to the blurb on the right, the idea behind her character was that she was going to have a comedic fighting style that utilized her various magical girl traits to create scenarios where things just kind of randomly happened and the opponent was incidentally damaged by them. Not unlike what they'd eventually do for Phoenix Wright and Marvel 3. Of all the scrapped characters I've covered in these videos, Komugi is by far the one they've gotten the most detailed with, and it makes me wonder what other characters we know didn't make the cut in other games would have been like. It's probably a legal minefield to go into all of that though. We know a lot about characters that were considered and cut from Marvel 3, but what about gameplay features? In some of the earliest public builds available of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, the game played a lot closer to Tatsunoko vs. Capcom in that it actually utilized its universal air dash mechanic. There are a ton of characters in Marvel 3 that have air dashes, but this would have extended to the entire cast. There's direct feed gameplay footage from E3 2010 of characters like Captain America and Wolverine air dashing around without a care in the world. Looking at the user interface, you can also see that the damage done per combo was also at one point displayed under the combo counter, just like it was in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. One thing that didn't make it into publicly playable builds was mentioned by Natsuma in an interview that involved level 3 hyper combos. Initially, every character in Marvel 3 had a level 3, but they decided to hold back on it because they felt that not every character was over the top enough to necessitate one. This is particularly notable in characters like Frank West and Beautiful Joe, both of whom had level 3s in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom but lost them in Marvel 3. Another thing I want to touch on isn't about a character that didn't make it in, but rather someone that almost didn't. During roster deliberations for the game, Capcom and Marvel communicated via translator, and during this time Marvel provided Capcom a list of characters that they absolutely did not want in the game. While we don't know all of the content of this list, we know from hints Natsuma has dropped over the years that it likely included a lot of characters from previous entries like Cyclops, Venom, and Juggernaut. Apparently, a Capcom translator happened to be combing over the list one day and noticed a character he was surprised to see on there: Deadpool. Deadpool was arguably near the peak of his popularity at that point in time, which made his inclusion on Marvel's no-go list even more baffling. So much so, in fact, that the translator actually ended up bringing this to both companies' attention. As it turns out, Deadpool being on that list was a result of some translation miscommunication between the two companies, and Deadpool was okayed by Marvel. Good thing too, since Deadpool is one of the most memorable roster inclusions in the game, and I think it'd lose a lot without him. Shoutouts to that Capcom translator, man. One last thing. According to Frank Thierry, who wrote the win quotes in Marvel 3 and penned the game's prequel tie-in comic, Capcom and Marvel were at one point in negotiations for a Marvel vs. Capcom comic book miniseries, and if you can believe it, a full-on animated series. The talks for these broke down unfortunately, but man, a Marvel vs. Capcom cartoon. Imagine that. And that wraps up this video and thus my coverage of cut content. There's still a lot more characters in Marvel 3 that were considered and didn't make it in, but I think my coverage of this aspect of the series has more or less run its course, and there are other videos out there detailing that aspect of Marvel 3's development in particular. It's always fun to imagine what could have been for video games, and I think it's fortunate that the minds behind these games have on multiple occasions let us peek behind the curtain, so to speak, to get a glimpse into these potential inclusions. So with all that said, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next video.